So part of the vision of our church is to take the story of Jesus Christ, the amazing story of Jesus Christ, and to use the arts as the vehicle to present that. And so to see what happened here this last week is just it's cool because it's fulfilling that vision that we talked about. Pastor Kevin did this really cool thing each day of the week. He spent just a few minutes teaching our kids the story of God, ending with the story of Jesus, because that's really the hinge point of the whole deal, right? And he used this really clever idea of giving each one of the kids a globe, a world, ball, just like that, with the symbolic idea that this is your life, this is your world. And you have a choice what you do with your world. You can live it for yourself, or if you would want to, the God who loved you so much that he came into this world to give his very life for you, if you'd like to turn your life over to him and let him take your world, he'll do that for you, and he'll give you a life that's spectacular life with him. So this is Friday. There's 60, 65 kids, whatever it is. There's a cross down here. You saw some of the pictures. And Pastor Kevin gave these kids the opportunity to take their world. Like, what kid gives a ball away, right? But virtually all of those children bought their globe, and they placed it at the foot of that cross to say, Jesus, you have my world. Is that awesome? That's great. So what specific decision each one of those kids made, for some, like this might surprise you. Like half the kids that came don't come from our church where they hear the story of Jesus. Every week in one way or another in that building over there, they hear about the love of Christ. Half the kids come from homes where we don't know if that's the case or not. And we know that some of them, this was a new story to them. And I just think some of them didn't just make their decision to give their world to Jesus, and they've already experienced his life-giving spirit in them. But I think some of those kids for the first time caught on to something, that there is a God, and God's personal, and he wants to have a friendship with them. And I think they gave their lives to him and experienced spiritual renewal in that moment. You know something? This is why we invest in our kids completely and fully. Because some of us found Jesus a little later in life. And what we found and we discovered in him, we so wish we had found that earlier on, because we would have avoided some heartbreak and hardship and difficulty. Well, here are kids. Imagine if early on in life, they can come to a knowledge of who Jesus is, and he can infill them with his spirit, and they can live their whole lives with them. Now that's a cool thing, and that's why we're investing so heavily in this campus, so that it's not about the building. It's a facility where more and more people, children, students, adults, can hear about the story of Jesus Christ. Like 2.5 years ago, we couldn't have done what happened this last week. We didn't have a facility. But God's graciously given it, and oh my goodness, how he's using it. So for those that helped this last week, volunteers galore, for Kevin and his team and the whole bunch. Our students did an amazing job. Thank you so much. I say that on behalf of the King. All right, so that's a good primer to talk about David. I don't know how it is, but it is, right? So the last few weeks we've been talking about King David, Israel's most famous king, great leader, great military leader. But here's the interesting thing. We've been trying to look at his life and some incidents in his life through what God thinks about when God thought about David. And there's a passage in the Bible in the New Testament that describes how God thinks about David when he thinks about him. And this is what it says. It says, David, a man about whom God said, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. And we've been thinking together these last weeks, well, what does that mean? We've narrowed it down. It's more than this, but we've narrowed it down to this kind of idea. A person after the heart of God is someone who orients their life toward God and organizes their life around him. And that's David. And he does it perfectly, and he does it beautifully, and he does it in an inspirational way at times. And then there are other times where you go, that's what it looks like to be a man after God's own heart? Like, what? He has major, catastrophic moral failures. Slips up on moral banana peels regularly. And yet here, God describes him as that gives hope for all of us. David, even in those times, is oriented toward God and organized around him. So, the last weeks we've been following his story. I'll catch you up a little bit where we're at real quickly. Saul is the king of the land, but David's king in waiting. Saul's wandered away from God. God replaces Saul with David, yet to be fully installed as the king. David has great success. He's the popular guy. The nation loves him because he's a military hero. And that makes Saul jealous, insanely jealous. And I know it's hard to believe, but you got to picture, for the next 10 years of the story, which we've been looking at, 10 to 12 years, Saul pursues David to not just demean him, but to decapitate him. He wants to kill David. Can you imagine being pursued by someone who's got the whole military at his beck and call, pursuing you for 10 to 12 years? And then on top of that, the guy's his father-in-law, right? Yeah, that's not good. That's family problems right there, right? But this is going on. And now we pick up David in what we're going to look at today. He's out in the wilderness once again, as he has been for the better part of this 10 to 12 year block. We're toward the end of it. He's hiding out, and Saul gets some intel where David is. Saul musters the troops once again, 3,000 elite troops, pursues David out into the wilderness, and lo and behold, they end up camping about at the same place. David discovers that Saul is there, and he does a little bit of nighttime reconnaissance to try to find out exactly maybe how equipped Saul is and what he faces, and this is where we're going to kind of pick up the story. But here's what I want us to look at together. What do you do if you really are a person who is oriented toward God and organized around him, a person who longs to be a person after the heart of God, and somebody does you wrong, not just once, not inadvertently, but intentionally, purposely to take you out for 10 to 12 years? How do you maintain a heart after God, and how do you deal with that person? What do you do? Now, few of us maybe have experienced it. Maybe some of us have been through a divorce that's really nasty, and it's been like that pursuit for 10, 12, 15 years. Some of us have other business situations that have developed because of it. Maybe some of us have. But this is an extraordinary situation to deal with. And we're going to see through it how David deals with that kind of element in his life, a man after the heart of God. So here we're going to pick it up. 1 Samuel 26, beginning in verse 7. It's going to come up on the screen. David and Abishai is his military leader. David and Abishai went right into Saul's camp and found him asleep, with his spear stuck in the ground beside his head. Abner, that's Saul's military leader, and the soldiers were lying asleep around him. In other words, the camp of the soldiers are all around Saul and Abner. They're right in the middle because that's the safest possible place. This daring, courageous guy, David, and Abishai sneak through right into the center of the camp, and this is where they find Saul. That's a gutsy move right there, okay? This is what Abishai says to David. God has surely handed your enemy over to you this time, Abishai whispered to David. Let me pin him to the ground. I'm a pro. I've done this before. I'll pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I won't need to strike twice. This will be stealth. We'll take him out and we'll get out of here, David. It's your moment. It's your opportunity. Let's do this. Let's settle this thing out. To which David says this. Verse 9, nope. Don't kill him. For who can remain innocent after attacking the Lord's anointed one? Pause for just a second. In that statement is a big theological idea. Theology, the study of God, who God is. In that simple statement, I want to pause a little bit because we got to get this part right of what David is saying. Now, when I say the word theology, your eyes start to close, right? Don't. Stay awake for this one because you got to get this about God. In that statement is how God thinks about you when he thinks about you. And here's what he thinks. He thinks you are of immeasurable, unimaginable value and dignity, and you have worth to him beyond what you can imagine. But here's the deal. Not just you. Every human being who's ever lived is a precious, precious treasure to God himself. Buckle up. Including the people who are out to get you. Including the people who have hurt you. Including the people who pursue you for 10 or 12 years trying to take their lives. Just because they're mean, just because they're bad, just because they're rotten and evil, does not diminish God's value he sees in them, worth he sees in them, the dignity he gives them. Settle on that one for a little bit, because you would actually like him to be a little ticked off at the people you're ticked off at. Am I right? But David is saying in this, Saul, because God made him, for no other reason possibly, but because God made Saul, Saul has imaginable value, worth, and deserving of dignity. It's just how God does it. Although Saul is a lost soul, and true, Saul is moving away from God, not moving toward God. Yes, Saul has a calloused heart. He's blind with resentment. He's not oriented or organized around God. Absolutely true. He is relentlessly hunting David, driven by the basest of motives, jealousy and envy. David says, I will not touch this man. I won't hurt him. I won't defame him. I won't say anything mean-spirited about him, because he's God's anointed. That means that God has picked him, not just for his kingly role. Yes, that too. But because by virtue of him being a human being, you and I are surrounded by people who are made in the image of God, and as such are worthy of the same sacred dignity as a human being that David has for Saul and God has for us. That's the big idea. That's the big theological idea. Genesis 1 says that we're made in God's image. There's some debate about what exactly that means. Does it mean we're made in his image because we have a personality, because we have a soul, because we have a moral conscience? Yeah, possibly. But what isn't debated typically is whether or not there is something unique about the human being from any other species. That uniqueness, whatever you want to call it, whether like you actually believe there's a God or not, is the uniqueness of how we're created in God's image, and we have immeasurable worth. And because that's the case, we are expected, and it's only just, if we treat people, all people, with the same dignity and respect, because they too are made in the image of God, not based on behavior, not based on their orientation toward God or away from him, just because they're made in God's image, period. That's a big theological idea about our God. And David gets it. David understands it. We assign value differently than God does. Just this last week, if you watched the news at all, you heard about the tragic death of Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain, both of whom decided this next step for their destiny was to take their own lives. And it's a tragic thing. It's such a sad thing. On Saturday, I was reading USA Today, and an article came out from Kristen Powers, who's an author. And I don't know much about her, but she wrote about those two incidents. And she makes this really interesting point. I don't know if she knows God, loves God. I don't know where she's at. But she writes this in her article about it. And she says there's something wrong in our culture. Rather than scientifically only evaluating why people make these choices and evaluating the despair and emotional suffering that people go through, the problem in part is that our culture values people based on escalating financial and personal and fame achievements. That's the value that's assigned. God doesn't value us on that basis. You can be famous or not. You can achieve or not. You can be whoever you are. God values us because we're made in his image. It's such a critical thing, because inevitably we are going to find people who disagree with us, are mean-spirited toward us, pursue us to do us harm, undermine us, lie to us, cheat on us, defraud us, do all those things, right? There's always going to be a gap of some kind or another, right? And what we fill that gap with indicates whether we've got this big idea of God or not, that they are of immeasurable value and worth, regardless of what they've done. David gets that. And so if that's what we get, there is nobody in the world that should be more appreciative of other people than us. Nobody should be kinder in our words. We should never exploit people. We should honor people in our speech. Gossip and demeaning words should never cross our lips. We express gratitude and praise freely and regularly and lavishly. We're reliable truth tellers. Why? Because that's the rules? No. Because you'll never do it consistently if those are the rules. We're rule breakers. But we will if we can see what David sees in Saul and God sees in us, that everybody around us throughout the world, whether they radically differ from us politically, morally, in whatever way, are of immeasurable worth and value and deserve our dignity. If you read the story a little further, you actually, if you put yourself in it, you would say, I think maybe Abishai's response is the more typical cultural response to someone pursuing you, like Saul pursues David, than David's response is. Do you know what Abishai essentially says? He says, hey, look at David, he wronged you. It would only be right for you to wrong him back. You know, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that kind of thing. It's payback time. It's deserved. It really would be just for you to take him out. After all, God's called you to his role. Look, Dave, he ruined your life. Like, put a little dent in his. Maybe it'll change him. Nobody should get away with what he's done. He's taken everything from you, David. 10, 12 years, you've nothing. You're wandering around. You've got nothing, and he took it all away from you. Why don't you take something away from him? You can hear it, right? We've actually thought that about people. Maybe somebody did something to you this morning, and you thought the same thing. Because this is us. But this is not what David does. Apparently, he thinks a little more like God does. This is what he says in verse 10. He says, surely the Lord will strike Saul down someday. Or he will die of old age. Or he'll die in battle. What's he saying? Those are three radically different choices. You know, the choice one, God will strike him. Yes, God, do that. I like that one. Like, you saw what he did. You saw what she did. Like, take them out. I mean, don't kill them. Well, maybe, but don't kill them. But get even with them, right? We like that option. We like this one. Maybe they'll die in battle as long as it's slow and painful, right? This is the one we don't like. It's the least popular. Maybe they'll die of old age. And justice will never happen. They'll never get what they deserve. It'll never even out. It'll never be balanced. Apparently, they'll never get what they deserve. And David's okay with it. Come on. He's okay with it. He says, God's got this. I'm leaving that one with God. That's not up to me to do that. The whole point is that God knows how this ends. I don't. The second point is this. God and God alone has the wisdom and knowledge and right to give each person what they deserve. God alone has that. You and I don't see properly. We don't see accurately. We don't know what actually is going on inside the person. We see what they do and we feel the effects, and so we apply to them, this must be your motive. We don't know that's right, but God knows what's right. And David is okay with Saul, saying, God, you figure it out. I don't need to. You figure it out. My role is to treat Saul with dignity, to respect him as someone who's made in your image, Jesus, just like I am. God, only you have the right, because you have perfect knowledge and love. And that's who you are, God. What David is saying to Abishai, because that's who he's talking to, is this: Abishai, the truth is you and I are alive only because we're made in the image of God. And God has perfect love and wisdom to give us what he knows that we deserve. And Abishai, we deserve some stuff. We really do. But because he values you and me so much, Abishai, his first option is to forgive us and to not give us what we deserve. And it's simply unjust, just Abishai even given the opportunity for us not to treat Saul the same way. It's unjust for us to receive this from God and then hold it to ourselves, protect it, and not share it with other people. That's not justice, and God won't put up with it. He won't. So in verse 11, David says to Abishai, "The Lord forbid that I should kill the one he has anointed. But take his spear and that jug of water beside his head, and let's get out of here before I do that. Let's go." David gets it. It appears a person who orients their lives toward God and organizes it around him understands forgiveness received necessarily means forgiveness is granted, and you can never separate those two. There's maybe something more here. I think David understands this. If David does not forgive Saul, David runs the risk of becoming like Saul. See, David had had a front row seat to Paul's diminished capacity to love, Saul's diminished capacity to reason, Saul's diminished capacity to actually be compassionate. And it happened through a process through the course of time. Saul thinks that he's been hard done by David. And David, he thinks, has conspired against him. And his response is envy and jealousy. And when that goes unabated, Saul becomes self-absorbed and bitter and resentful, vindictive, and just plain cruel. That's who he becomes. And I think David reasons that if I'm going to be a man after the heart of God, I have to do this differently than Saul did. And the way that I do it differently is by forgiving the guy for what he's done, consistently and repeatedly. And this is why forgiveness is so hard for us. It really is hard for us. You see, here's the thing with forgiveness. It usually needs to be given before we feel like giving it. It really does. It really requires a commitment before the feelings might ever be there. It means this kind of commitment. There's three parts to it. One is, it means not bringing up the things that have happened with the other person who has done it for the sake of punishing them. Doesn't mean you don't bring it up, but you got to be really careful with your motives why we're bringing it up. Secondly, it means not bringing it up with others as a way of punishing the other person by diminishing their reputation or who they are. Forgiveness can't come if that's still part of the vocabulary. And then thirdly, it means not bringing it up with ourselves over and over again and rehearsing it, because that inflames us and that draws more, and then it actually multiplies what happens inside of us and our feelings toward that person. It's a commitment to not do those things. Or genuine forgiveness is really difficult. So, never bring it up? No, bring it up. But you got to really be careful of your motives why you're bringing it up. This is how David does it. In verse 12 it says, "So David took the spear and jug of water that were near Saul's head. Then he and Abishai got away without anyone seeing them or even waking up, because the Lord had put Saul and his men into a deep sleep. David climbed the hill opposite the camp until he was a safe distance, and he shouted down at the soldiers to Abner, son of Ner," that was Saul's general, right? "Wake up, Abner." "Who is it?" Abner demanded. "Well, Abner, you're a great man, aren't you?" David taunted. "Where in all Israel is there anyone as mighty as you? So why haven't you guarded your master the king when someone came to kill him? This isn't good at all. I swear by the Lord that you and your men deserve to die because you failed to protect your master, the Lord's anointed. You failed to value him. Look around. Where are the king's spear and jug of water that were beside his head?" Saul recognized David's voice and called out, "Is that you, my son David?" And David replied, "Yes, you jerk." "No, yes, my Lord, the king." Here's what David does. Maybe against his human nature, but because he valued and treasured Saul, because Saul was made in God's image. We already know that David doesn't take his life when he has a chance. Second thing that he does, he actually defends Saul to Abner. He doesn't say to Abner, "Abner, you're following a loser king there. Like, look at what he's done for 10, 12 years. He's tried to take me out. He'll never be able to take me out. And why are you following a guy like that? You can do so much better, Abner." You know what his motives are? You know what he's going to eventually get you, Abner, because that's how he does. That's what he did. He's going to do that to you. He doesn't do that. In fact, he chides Abner for not respecting by protecting Saul. He's defending Saul. When's the last time that someone hurt you and your response is to defend them? Who would ever do that? Well, God would. Because we have deeply offended God, if we can offend God. And his response is, I'm coming to rescue you. I'm going to defend you because I made you. You have immeasurable value and worth to me. I'm not going to demean you for jacking things up. I'm coming to get you. The third thing he does is he addresses Saul with a term of honor rather than mocking him or belittling him when he clearly had the upper hand. David does not tell him that he's a terrible leader. He doesn't tell him that he's a disgrace to God and Israel. He doesn't remind Saul that God has rejected him and favored David, all of which are true. But David says, this isn't the time to do that. That's not going to cross my lips. I am going to honor the man because he's made in God's image. He's anointed in that kind of way. Now, here's the warning label on all that. If you do respond that way, the warning is this: do not expect to feel good or vindicated when you do that. Do not expect a hero's welcome. Do not expect an attaboy. You're not going to feel that. There's a very strong likelihood that you're going to feel that justice has not been served. That you just let the other person get away with something. That you're paying an additional price, maybe even the whole price for someone else's wrongdoing. That will never feel good. It won't. I read this story from a relationship journal that came out a few years ago. This is what it reads. It says, once I was engaged to a young woman who changed her mind. I forgave her, but I could only forgive her in small over the course of a year. Here's how I forgave her. Every time when I spoke with her, I refrained from rehashing the past. I did it whenever I renounced jealousy and self-pity when seeing her with another man. I did it when I praised her to others when I really wanted to slice away at her reputation. Those were the payments I made. Pain is the consequence of sin. There is no easy way to deal with it. Wood, nails, and pain are the currency of forgiveness. But it is a love that really does heal. Why does he call it payment in the article? What's he paying? It's this. If you have a car and you lend it to someone and the thing gets wrecked, the person wrecks your car, but you need the car for transportation and you value the car and it's got to be fixed, there's only two ways that thing gets fixed. And somebody's going to pay for it. It's either the person who wrecks it that's going to pay for it, or you are. There's no other way it gets fixed. And for you, it means not only inconvenience and higher insurance, but the cost of the repairs. It might even be a greater inconvenience and a greater problem. At the end of the article, this young man says, I could have tried to get her to pay, but I paid for it myself. And surprising to me, slowly, I became free. And this is how it works, as hard as it is. But here's what I know. Right about now, some of us are asking the question that I get asked virtually every time we talk about forgiveness. And I wonder if it isn't a question that whether Abishai verbalized or not, he had for David. I wonder if he didn't think this. David, hold on just a second here. Are you saying that Saul's just going to get away without any consequence to himself? Worse than that, David, are you not going to confront Saul about this? That isn't right. You see, you're enabling him if you don't confront him on this. He's just going to get away with it more. You have to confront him, David. You have to. And David will agree. But David does it in such a unique way. Maybe he does it the way someone who's oriented toward God and organized around God. Remember how he took Saul's spear and water jug? And then he goes to higher ground? The story tells us that. Why did he go to higher ground? Well, yeah, he could talk down to the camp and they could hear him. But I think he also made his way to a place where it was safe, where Saul wouldn't throw a spear at him again. He had done that a couple of times. I think that's wise on David's part. Let's get some distance here. Let's talk, but let's get some distance. But what does David say to confront him? It's really brilliant. In verse 18, he says, Saul, rather than accuse you of something, I have some questions for you. Why are you chasing me? What have I done? What is my crime? David is teaching us that a person who orients their life toward and organizes around God, he confronts with questions, not accusations and innuendos. Left to ourselves, maybe more accurately, left to myself, I've seen it again this week. I would rather tend to do this. Either go, oh, no, I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to do this. I'm just going to bear the weight of it. But inside I seethe and I boil at the injustice of it. That's actually not forgiveness. Or let them have it. Go after them. Confront to punish. Make them feel bad. Shame them. And David does it a totally different way. He forgives Saul progressively from his heart, and then he talks to Saul out of love. You know that because he asks questions. He's looking for information. He's trying to understand, not trying to help Saul understand. David shows us an alternative way for the sake of his love for Saul. And then just to finish this up, David doesn't stop there. David does ask him these questions and confronts him. And a little bit later in verse 21, we pick it up there. It says, "Then Saul confessed, 'I have sinned. Come back home, my son, and I'll no longer try to harm you, for you valued my life today. I've been a fool and very, very wrong.'" It worked, right? Let's try that next time, because that's the guaranteed end result. No, it's not. Not by any means. You have no idea what the result will be, just like David didn't know. But David stays at a distance. Saul responds in this way, but here's the thing. David still doesn't trust him. Saul has to earn his trust. We know that because in the end of the chapter, we read that David goes and flees from there, and he goes to another place to protect himself and to be safe. Saul's going to have to prove himself. This topic has become very real for me to think through carefully and search my own soul this last week. This past week, somebody did something unthinkably ugly to somebody that I love a lot. I'm not going to give you too much detail because I want to protect the person this happened to. But someone defrauded and stole a really large sum of money from this person I love by taking advantage of their vulnerability. They deceived the person that I love, and they hurt them very, very deeply. It's highly unlikely that we'll ever get the money back. And all this week, I have been talking and praying and processing. How in all the world could people do something like that? But I've been asking another thing. How in all the world does someone who longs to have a heart that's oriented toward God and organize around Him, how do you deal with that when it's personal, when it's not theoretical, and it's not a theological idea in the Bible, but it's real, and you're living it, and you feel the resentment, and you feel the anger, and you feel, I want to get even with you. I'll do whatever it takes to get the money back to the person I love so much. What do you do when theological ideas aren't theoretical ideas? Where do you find some strength to actually do what David did? It's remarkable what he does after 10 or 12 years of relentlessly being pursued to take his life by. Isn't it remarkable? It's almost you go, I could never do that. Yep. But the Bible is not theoretical. God's love is not a theory. It's real. We live in it. And I've been living in it this week. Where do we find the strength? Where did David find the strength? As much as we look at David as anointed by God, David is actually pointing to Jesus, the truly perfectly anointed one. There have been two verses from Scripture this last week that have been go-tos for me. One is Luke 24:34. Jesus is hanging on a cross. He looks down at those who have nailed him there and are throwing tomatoes and jeers and insults at him. And he says, Father, would you forgive them? they don't know what they're doing. Did they know what they were doing? Absolutely they did. Absolutely they did. But what Jesus was doing is leaving his case with his Father and saying, God, you know them better than I do. And the truth is they don't really know, because if they knew who they were hanging up on a cross right now, they wouldn't do it. But they don't know, and forgive them. The second one that I've gone to this week over and again is 1 Peter 2:23. He did not retaliate when he was insulted, nor threaten revenge when he suffered. He left his case in the hands of God, who always judges fairly. You see, in our world, there's always a gap that's going to happen between people in relationships. People are going to disappoint us. They're going to respond badly. They're going to hurt us. And then there's a gap, right? There's a gap between what we expect, what we hope for, what they should do. Sometimes that gap is really big because people do the worst, unbelievably bad things in our world. But here's the thing. What do you fill that gap with? See, that's our choice. What we put in that gap, that's up to us. We can put resentment and hate and fear, and we can respond badly. Or we can do what the King of the universe did. He filled that gap with grace. With grace. With amazing grace. I'm trying to learn that this week. It's been a challenge. You see, you don't just turn it on and turn it off. But I think where there are differences, where people have hurt us, there actually is a path forward. There really is. And our Savior showed us the way forward for that. Can we pray together? Jesus, thank you for your grace and your goodness, for the way that you model and demonstrate something to us that is profound and amazing. It's actually hard to grasp sometimes. But you're teaching me, and maybe in some different way than this, you taught David, that if we look to you, Jesus, if we look to you, and we see what you've done for us, that we're actually stirred by the love that you've demonstrated and the way that you have forgiven. And that can actually propel us to a place where we think differently about those who is so hard to forgive, who hurt us so badly and so repeatedly. Jesus, would you help us to do that? There's something in us that we want to be oriented towards you and organized around you. And we simply look to you to experience ourselves what we want to extend to others. Would you help us, Jesus? To that end, we're grateful for your promise to do so. Thank you so much. Amen.